and I fell by myself.
The Last of Us has never been a series about hope. Rolling the credits on the first game, players were met with a gray area ending that questions the morality of saving a girl at the cost of thousands of others. How much does she mean to you? Does that justify your actions? And what would you have done if this was you in the situation? There were a lot of questions to unpack, and despite the melancholy ending, it resonated with countless players, including myself. The Last of Us Part 2 is just that, the other half of this story, not another story with the same cast. Part 2 dives into themes of despair, revenge, and acceptance, all feelings that resonate with the emotions left at the end of the first game. Going into Part 2, I wasn't sure if The Last of Us needed a sequel. I enjoyed the first game and liked how things ended on a rather sour note. After completing Part 2, I've changed my mind. The Last of Us Part 2 shows that there is more complex emotions in this world to tell, and more sides of the story to tell. The Last of Us Part 2 opens up with a now 19-year-old Ellie, 4 years after the events of the first game. Despite being the apocalypse, Ellie is still dealing with a lot of the usual aspects of a 19-year-old lesbian. She scribbles aspiring song lyrics in her journal, struggles with relationships, and deals with rebellious moments with her flawed father figure Joel, and sadly, still has to deal with bigotry. As with all young adults, she's slowly maturing, but part of the learning is making mistakes, and sometimes more than once. 4 years is a long time though, and the Ellie we saw at the end of the first game has matured in some aspects and stayed the same in others. She settled into the town of Jackson, she has her group of friends, and for the most part, has had an as routine life as you can get during the apocalypse. Along with this new home is a town full of people, including the new supporting cast. Shannon Woodward as Dina provides a lighthearted and humorous contrast to Ellie's more occasional dense moments. Her jokes at Ellie's expense reminded me a lot of Ellie's interactions with Joel in the first game. Stephen Chang as newcomer Jesse had a kind demeanor when around his friends, but a more mature, serious one when needed. He felt like a grounded rock among the rest of the young adults. Of course, Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker deliver their masterful roles as Ellie and Joel respectively. Ashley perfectly captures the turmoil and trauma Ellie must endure, while Troy exudes the energy of a withered man who has done multiple wrongdoings for the sake of his loved ones. Laura Bailey, who you may know as Mary Jane from Spider-Man PS4, and Catherine with a C in Atlas's puzzle RPG, plays a new character that we equally see her struggle with her own morals. Like a lot of the characters in The Last of Us, we see her come to her lowest of lows and highest of highs as she too questions the right thing to do. What The Last of Us 2 excels at is writing humanizing characters in a terrible setting. Never did the series imply or leave an impression that I was playing as the good guy in the original, nor the good girl in the sequel. Arguably, The Last of Us takes place in a world that's gone to hell, and like Ellie, the younger generation was born into this world, and has never known any other type of world. I don't fault these characters for being shitty people at times, nor did I ever really feel as if I was forced to be them. Rather, like the movie Uncut Gems, I rooted for the best of the main characters, but realized early on, I'm not them. I'm engulfed in their journey, but I'm only along for the ride, and what a ride it was. Part 2's gameplay is reminiscent of the original's gameplay, albeit with a much more nimble and young protagonist at the helm. Unlike Joel, Ellie is young, quick on her feet, and she's finally learned to swim. As a result, The Last of Us Part 2 feels familiar yet evolved from the original. Things like finding a raft to lay on are things of the past. Helping to craft the gameplay is the variety of new environments to roam through, from the luscious overgrown city of Seattle, underground sewers, abandoned apartment buildings, and the snowy terrain of Wyoming. Roaming around these locations are two new enemy factions, the WLF and the Seraphites. The WLF, or Washington Liberation Force, communicate verbally and arguably more human-like than most enemy NPCs do in video games, yelling to each other on a first-name basis. These enemies come off as real people with real connection to these characters that are otherwise just enemies to myself. In a sense, there's this feeling of remorse and guilt for fighting them in the first place, especially considering they've trained dogs to attack you. The Seraphites, on the other hand, communicate with mostly whistles and fight with bows as opposed to the usual ammunition. Of course, besides these two factions, there's this ever-looming threat of the infection. The familiar species like clickers and runners are back, along with the dangerous bloaters. Charles Darwin has not been too kind though, and the infected have too evolved. A new species of infected called Shambler joined the fray. Looking almost like a bloater, these abominations throw spore bombs, completely cutting you off from cover and escape routes. The old species have gotten new skills too, like the stalkers now being able to be quiet to the point of not coming up on your hearing ability. The Last of Us dabbles in the horror genre of course, but I never felt this series truly feel horror-like until I found myself surrounded by silent stalkers and a handful of other types of infected. The experience left me anxious to say the least. although together these enemies both feel familiar and new, providing a fresh breath of air to the enemy encounters of the first game. Where The Last of Us originally had a linear design, Part 2 takes some notes from Uncharted 4 and features some open world areas. Now this isn't completely open world by any means, but the early Seattle areas introduce a welcome change to the series formula. You're tasked with exploring the mini sandbox area around you, looking for clues towards your next objective. The Last of Us improves on this Uncharted formula by actually adding collectibles and reasoning to continue to explore. Whether it's new pickups to upgrade your weapons, collectible trading cards, or just notes from those that were once here, telling side stories that you would otherwise miss if you didn't read them. One thing I do want to commend Naughty Dog for, that is rarely touched upon, is the accessibility options presented at the start and throughout The Last of Us Part 2. From the start of the game, options are presented to help make the gameplay more accessible to those struggling to play video games. Well beyond the usual make the subtitles bigger option, The Last of Us Part 2 features a full-on visual change for those that may struggle to hear, and unique controller features for those that can't play with the default option. Anytime a new controller feature was introduced, a pop-up would come up with the option to change it if you needed help. These options didn't apply to me, but for someone that depends on these choices, this makes or breaks an experience for someone, let alone gives them the chance to even have the experience with the game in the first place. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most stunning looking games during this console generation. Without a doubt, this punches at the same weight class as other critically acclaimed games such as Red Dead Redemption 2 and God of War. While I could go on and on about the beautiful lighting design, luscious and saturated environments, and cinematic cutscene composition, what stood out most to me was the animation and performances. Throughout its gameplay, The Last of Us Part 2 uses contextual animation to seamlessly create a fluid animation between running, attacking, reacting, and plenty of other actions. Where most current third-person action games have a jump cut animation between certain frames, characters in The Last of Us feel completely smooth. As a result, this is the snappiest a Naughty Dog game has felt, and the combat certainly feels better because of it. In terms of performance, The Last of Us Part 2 sees a similar performance to Uncharted 4 with the 1440p resolution and mostly solid 30fps on PS4 Pro. That gets bumped down to a mostly 30fps at 1080p on the base PS4. While it's nowhere near the full 4K resolution some would have hoped with first-party games on PS4 Pro, the final image is nothing short of marvelous. While it's easy to see the extraordinary visuals on display here, I'd be remiss if I didn't take the time to talk about the immensely impressive audio design throughout Part 2's campaign. It's apparent throughout the different environments that Ellie travels through. Roaming through the empty streets of Seattle, I could hear the grass being crushed to the sound of my shoes as water droplets would fall onto my gun. Without any enemies in the area, it almost sounded like an ASMR recording just taken outside in the wilderness. It's completely immersive. Add on to that the attention to detail with the NPC's reactions that create more personal reactions than I've ever experienced in another video game. It felt oddly human-like. In a world of non-stop tragedy, it makes the world feel almost grounded within more realism. I know this is just a video game, and I know these are just actors, but their performances left me enthralled and flabbergasted both in terms of astonishment and guilt. Part of that emotional turmoil was also due to the incredible work done by Gustavo Santaolalla as a series composer. The man does some incredible music work in Part 2 that easily creates some of the most memorable moments both during cutscenes and in gameplay. The Last of Us Part 2 is a dark, tragic second half to Joel and Ellie's original story. It's not a happy game, nor has it ever been a happy series. This is a story of despair, revenge, and every feeling in between. With Ellie in the spotlight, we tag along for the ride of emotional despair, one with layers of tragedy for everyone involved. Naughty Dog once again shows their ever-evolving storytelling that's only improved since the early days of the Uncharted series to what is one of the best video game experiences this generation. In combination with improved action and stealth combat via what was learned with Uncharted 4, The Last of Us Part 2 reaches new heights for Naughty Dog, and video games as an art form.